August 1942 to February 1943. On the banks of the Volga River, the fate of World War II hangs in the balance. German and Soviet armies clash in the most brutal urban battle in history. Over 5 months of savage fighting, Stalingrad will become a graveyard for Hitler's ambitions and the turning point of the entire war. This is the story of the Battle of Stalingrad, where 2 million soldiers fought among ruins and rubble, where winter and determination defeated what seemed like an unstoppable war machine, and where the tide of World War II turned forever toward Allied victory. By summer 1942, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union had reached a critical phase. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had driven deep into Soviet territory but failed to achieve decisive victory before winter halted German advances. Moscow had been saved, Leningrad besieged, and the Red Army, though blooded, remained unbroken. Hitler now sought to deliver a knockout blow by seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus and cutting Soviet supply lines along the Volga River. Case Blue, Germany's 1942 summer offensive, aimed to capture Stalingrad and the Caucasus simultaneously. Stalingrad, a major industrial city stretching along the western bank of the Volga, was strategically vital. The city controlled river traffic, produced tanks and weapons in massive factories, and bore the name of Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. Its capture would cut Soviet supply lines and provide a gateway to the oil-rich Caucasus. German Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, launched the offensive in June 1942. Initial advances were spectacular, with German forces racing across the southern Soviet steppes and capturing thousands of prisoners. However, the offensive soon encountered problems. German logistics struggled to supply forces advancing hundreds of kilometers across devastated terrain. Soviet resistance, though initially chaotic, began to stiffen as Stalin issued Order 227, not one step back, threatening any soldier who retreated with summary execution. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was assigned to capture Stalingrad. Paulus commanded approximately 270,000 troops supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft from the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet. This was one of Germany's finest field armies, blooded by 2 years of nearly continuous victories. German soldiers believed Stalingrad would fall quickly, allowing them to advance further east before winter. Soviet forces defending Stalingrad initially consisted of the 62nd Army under General Vasily Chuikov and the 64th Army under General Mikhail Shumilov. These armies had been badly mauled during the German advance and were desperately short of men, weapons, and supplies. However, Chuikov was a tough, determined commander who understood urban warfare's brutal realities and was prepared to fight for every building and street. On August 23, 1942, the German Sixth Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. That same day, the Luftwaffe launched massive air raids against the city, dropping thousands of tons of bombs and incendiaries. The bombing created firestorms that killed tens of thousands of civilians and reduced much of the city center to rubble. Ironically, the rubble created excellent defensive terrain that would favor Soviet defenders in the coming battle. German forces drove to the Volga north of the city, cutting Stalingrad off from overland reinforcement routes. However, Soviet forces maintained a vital ferry route across the Volga, bringing reinforcements and supplies at night while evacuating wounded and civilians. German artillery and aircraft constantly targeted these ferries, but Soviet boatmen continued their dangerous missions with remarkable courage. The battle quickly devolved into savage urban warfare. German forces advanced into the city, encountering fierce Soviet resistance at every factory, building, and street corner. Soviet defenders employed tactics specifically designed for urban combat: small assault groups armed with submachine guns, grenades, and satchel charges that could strike German positions and disappear into ruins before German artillery could respond. General Chuikov established his command post on the Volga's west bank, refusing to retreat across the river despite being under constant fire. His presence inspired Soviet soldiers fighting in the ruins, demonstrating that commanders shared their dangers. Chuikov's tactical doctrine emphasized hugging German forces, fighting at such close range that German artillery and air support could not be employed without hitting their own troops. The Mamayev Kurgan, a hill in the city center providing commanding views, became the scene of particularly brutal fighting. Soviet and German forces fought for control of this vital position in battles so intense that the hill's soil was later found to contain more steel fragments from shells and bombs than earth. Possession of the hill changed hands repeatedly, with both sides suffering catastrophic casualties. The Red October steel factory, the Barrikady gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory became fortresses where Soviet workers and soldiers fought side by side. Workers manufactured tanks and weapons while combat raged around them, sometimes rolling tanks directly from factory floors into battle. When factories finally fell to German assault, the buildings were so damaged they provided little military value. By October 1942, the battle had settled into a desperate struggle for survival. The city was a moonscape of ruins where life expectancy for Soviet soldiers was measured in hours. Combat occurred at close quarters, room to room, floor to floor, sometimes with enemies occupying different floors of the same building. Snipers on both sides hunted targets among the rubble. Hand-to-hand combat with knives, entrenching tools, and sharpened stakes became common. Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev became legendary for his kills of German soldiers, reportedly eliminating 225 enemy combatants during the battle. His duel with a German sniper, allegedly a major sent specifically to kill him, became famous through later books and films. Whether entirely factual or partially propaganda, Zaitsev's exploits inspired Soviet soldiers and demonstrated that individual courage could make a difference. German forces controlled approximately 90% of Stalingrad by November, but Soviet defenders clung to narrow strips along the Volga and refused to surrender. Chuikov's 62nd Army had been reinforced repeatedly, with fresh divisions ferried across the Volga to replace units destroyed in combat. These reinforcements attacked immediately upon arrival, giving Germans no respite and preventing them from consolidating gains. Soviet commanders refined urban warfare tactics through bitter experience. Assault groups typically consisted of 6 to 8 men armed with submachine guns, grenades, and anti-tank rifles. These groups infiltrated German positions at night, attacking headquarters and supply depots to create chaos. Soviet engineers became experts at demolitions, collapsing buildings on German positions or mining structures to create traps. German soldiers, trained for mobile warfare, found urban combat exhausting and demoralizing. The constant danger from snipers, the uncertainty about enemy positions, and the inability to employ their advantages in tanks and artillery wore down German morale. Soldiers who had conquered France and driven to Moscow's gates found themselves fighting desperately for individual buildings in a ruined city they could neither capture nor abandon. Winter arrived in November, bringing temperatures below freezing. Neither side was adequately prepared. German soldiers lacked winter clothing and suffered frostbite. Soviet soldiers were better equipped for cold but still endured terrible hardships. The Volga began to freeze, complicating Soviet supply efforts but eventually allowing supplies to cross on ice roads. Fighting continued through blizzards and sub-zero temperatures. While German forces bled themselves white in Stalingrad's ruins, Soviet High Command planned a massive counteroffensive. Operation Uranus, conceived by General Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky, would strike not at Stalingrad itself but at the weak Romanian armies protecting German flanks north and south of the city. These satellite armies, poorly equipped and lacking anti-tank weapons, would collapse under Soviet assault, allowing Soviet forces to encircle the entire German Sixth Army. Soviet preparations were meticulous and conducted in complete secrecy. Over 1 million troops, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft were concentrated for the offensive. German intelligence failed to detect the buildup, focused as it was on the fighting within Stalingrad. Hitler and German commanders believed Soviet forces were exhausted and incapable of major offensive operations. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus began with massive artillery bombardments against Romanian positions north of Stalingrad. Soviet tank and mechanized corps smashed through Romanian lines, which collapsed almost immediately. The following day, Soviet forces attacked south of the city with similar success. German commanders recognized the danger but lacked reserves to contain the breakthrough. Within 4 days, Soviet pincers met at Kalach, west of Stalingrad, completing the encirclement. The entire German Sixth Army, approximately 290,000 troops, was trapped in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide. General Paulus requested permission to break out while escape was still possible, but Hitler refused, ordering Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad and promising relief and supply by air. The Luftwaffe attempted to supply the trapped army by air, but the effort was doomed from the start. Hermann Göring had promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily, but this was impossible given available aircraft, winter weather, and Soviet air defenses. On best days, German transport aircraft delivered perhaps 100 tons. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns shot down dozens of aircraft. Sixth Army began to starve. Life inside the Kessel, the cauldron, as Germans called the pocket, quickly became nightmarish. Food rations were cut repeatedly as supplies dwindled. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Wounded could not be properly treated due to lack of medical supplies. Frostbite casualties mounted as temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers burned furniture and ammunition crates for warmth. Soviet forces tightened the noose, launching attacks to compress the pocket and prevent any breakout attempt. German forces fought desperately, knowing that surrender meant probable death in Soviet prison camps. However, their position was hopeless. Ammunition ran low. Artillery had insufficient shells to support defensive operations. Tanks and vehicles were immobilized by lack of fuel. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted a relief operation in December, attacking towards Stalingrad with a hastily assembled army group. Operation Winter Storm initially made progress, reaching within 48 kilometers of the pocket. Paulus prepared to break out to meet the relief force, but Hitler again refused permission to abandon Stalingrad. Manstein's attack stalled against Soviet resistance, and the relief force was driven back. Sixth Army's last hope died. Soviet commanders launched Operation Ring in January 1943 to liquidate the pocket. Massive artillery bombardments preceded infantry assaults that systematically reduced German defensive positions. Soviet forces split the pocket in two, then into smaller fragments. German resistance continued but became increasingly futile. Rations were reduced to 75 grams of bread per day. Thousands died daily from starvation, disease, and cold. On January 30, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, noting that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: Paulus was expected to commit suicide rather than surrender. However, Paulus chose differently. On January 31, Soviet forces captured his headquarters, and Paulus surrendered. Fighting continued in isolated pockets for 2 more days before the last German forces laid down their weapons on February 2, 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was the bloodiest battle in human history. Soviet casualties exceeded 1.1 million killed, wounded, and missing. German and Axis casualties totaled approximately 850,000. The entire German Sixth Army was destroyed. Nearly 100,000 captured soldiers would march into Soviet prison camps, and only about 6,000 would survive to return to Germany years later. 24 German generals surrendered, including Paulus. The city of Stalingrad was utterly destroyed. Of the 400,000 civilians present when battle began, perhaps 40,000 survived. The factories that produced tanks and weapons were ruins. Buildings that survived stood as hollow shells among acres of rubble. The human cost for civilians caught in the battle was incalculable: starvation, disease, combat, and cold killed tens of thousands. Strategically, Stalingrad marked the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. German forces would never again mount a successful strategic offensive against the Soviet Union. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Soviet morale soared while German morale plummeted. Axis allies began questioning their association with Germany. The initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Hitler's insistence on holding Stalingrad at all costs had destroyed one of Germany's finest armies for no strategic gain. The fall of Stalingrad forced German withdrawal from the Caucasus and shortened German lines throughout southern Russia. German casualties and equipment losses could never be fully replaced. The balance of power on the Eastern Front shifted decisively toward the Soviet Union. The Battle of Stalingrad became central to Soviet and Russian national identity. The defense of the city demonstrated Soviet determination and resilience. The victory proved that Nazi Germany could be defeated and marked the beginning of the long march to Berlin. Every Soviet citizen knew someone who fought at Stalingrad or lost family members there. Stalingrad was rebuilt after the war and renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization. However, the city's wartime name remains synonymous with the battle. The Mamayev Kurgan hosts an enormous memorial complex crowned by the towering statue the motherland calls, one of the world's largest statues. The memorial receives millions of visitors annually. Veterans of Stalingrad were honored as heroes throughout Soviet and Russian history. Their courage and sacrifice were celebrated in films, books, and commemorations. The battle demonstrated that ordinary Soviet citizens, despite suffering enormous casualties, could defeat a seemingly invincible enemy through determination and courage. For Germany, Stalingrad represented catastrophic defeat and the beginning of the end. The German people were told their army had fought heroically but been overwhelmed by Soviet numbers. The reality, that Hitler's strategic incompetence had doomed Sixth Army, was carefully concealed. German veterans who survived Soviet captivity returned home years later as shadows of their former selves. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as testament to human endurance, courage, and the terrible cost of war. For 5 months, soldiers on both sides fought in conditions that defy imagination: cold, hunger, constant danger, and death everywhere. They fought among ruins for control of a destroyed city that had become a symbol more than a strategic objective. The victory at Stalingrad came at enormous cost but changed history's course. The Soviet Union would drive westward from Stalingrad, eventually capturing Berlin and ending Nazi Germany. The courage shown by Soviet soldiers defending every building and street inspired their nation and demonstrated that fascism could be defeated. Today, the ruins have been cleared and the city rebuilt, but the memory remains. The Volga still flows past the city where millions fought and died. The memorial on Mamayev Kurgan stands eternal watch over the fallen. The battle reminds us of war's terrible price and the courage of those who fight when civilization itself hangs in the balance. If you found this documentary powerful, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more military history content. Share this story to honor the memory of all who fought at Stalingrad. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this pivotal battle. Thank you for watching, and never forget the lessons of Stalingrad.